Today I'm going to be delighted to be talking to you about publishing with efficiency. And the reason I started talking about this and choosing this as a topic is that for a lot of people, publishing can be a little bit frightening, and you can feel a little, I don't know, like, how do I start? And even once you've done it even a few times, it always feels like you learn something new. A lot of this is a bit of like lessons learned across a couple, now decades, scary for me to think about that, but of publishing and kind of reflecting on what were the things that can make it easier. And so what you're going to have here is a mix of sort of how to and then tips, even if you're have done this before, that I found helpful. And even going back and looking these in preparation for this talk, I'm like, oh yeah, I should be doing that. So these are the kinds of things that you sort of absorb, and they're formulas. Nobody's perfect. Sometimes you forget to do these things, but hopefully this presentation will serve as either a reminder or an how-to guide to make this process less scary. So just a little bit about myself. I am a professor, an associate department chair, and interim vice chair of research, too many titles right now, at the University of New Mexico, Department of Family Medicine. Before being here, I was at the University of Wisconsin, and then before that, I did my residency in Virginia. So I feel like I've gradually had traveled west across my career. A lot of my work, so I see patients, and then I also do a lot of research, and I do research in two different areas. One is really about how do we improve primary care practice. And what I really care about is how do we bring patients' voices, and particularly those voices that are not traditionally heard, how do we elevate those to make care better? So a lot of what I do is very applied in terms of my own research that I enjoy doing with teams. So with that background, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our talk, and just a second. Okay. We're going to really be talking about how to break down the writing process. So we're going to be talking about this in 4 different steps. First, how do you choose targets for your journals? And this is something that's not really talked about enough, but we'll go into that in a little bit more detail than almost anything else, because finding the right place to publish actually makes your life so much better and saves a lot of rejection and heartache. Then we're going to spend some time thinking about how do you actually structure your writing team? Who do you work with? We'll go into the sort of the basics, the formula of almost every scientific article, which is going through the introduction, methods, results, discussion, and an abstract, and giving you some sort of tips and what to look for along the way. And then lastly, we'll be talking about what do you do to actually finalize your submission, and what are some good practices around that. So let's start with those choosing the journal targets. So I like to think about these all in terms of what questions should I be answering as I'm thinking about a journal. And so we're going to go through these in some detail. And I know you can read them, but first, I think it's really important to think about your audience, right? Hopefully you're writing because you want to have a conversation with people. And who are the people that you want to read your article and do something with the information you're providing? So I know that sounds really basic, but to me, that's like the fundamental question of where you should publish. So if you want to impact other family physicians, you might be targeting primary care journals. If you want to propose a particular method or a way about doing something differently, you might go somewhere else. Or if you're doing work about disparities and you want to impact policy around disparities, you might target a different audience, maybe journals targeted towards leaders. Now, the next thing is the practical part, right? How quickly do you want to get this in print? So there's some journals that are, really well renowned, but I mean, I was recently mentioning, like I had a place that we had to go back and forth 5 times before they eventually accepted the journal. So that took about 1.5 years. It was a little painful. It was a really good journal, but 5 times, sometimes in your life, depending if you're thinking about promotion and how many articles you want to get out, if that's important to you, you may not want to pick something where it takes, 1 year or 2 years to get something out in print. It might be important for different reasons to get this out faster. So that's one thing that you can sometimes find on websites. And if not, you could always contact the managing editor to get a general sense of how long our submission's taking these days. The next thing is, what's your tolerance of rejection, right? So for people are different, and this is like the thing I think that's not talked about too much. For some people, it can be very affirming to get in a journal that publishes many of its articles. And it's just great to feel like you're a published author. You need that kind of confidence boost. It just feels good. And, so you think about journals that way. For other people, they want to get it out there. They're shooting for the stars, right? Like they're hoping to get it in like a big, very difficult to publish journal like JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine. I'll give some examples of like that, but that's important. If they could do that, that would be their dream. So you want to think about that as well. And then lastly, more and more open access journals have become a thing, and they can charge up to, I've seen prices as high as $3,000 per article. In the past, we used to, I think there was some looking down on pay for published journals, but over the past, particularly like 5 years, I would say these open access journals have become more popular, and there's really good journals out there that do charge a publication fee rather than getting money through advertisement. So that's a consideration. Do you have resources through your CME funds or other funds that you're able to pay for those open access journals? The good thing about open access is that it is true that often, because they're available, people actually can find your journal article a little sooner. It can get cited. So it does open up the conversation in different ways, perhaps, than ones that your readers have to pay a publication fee to access. Okay, I want to talk briefly about predatory journals. So with the rise of open access, there's also these journals out there that are called predatory journals, meaning that they really are that pay to publish. They almost guarantee publications for you. And there's a couple of ways to spot them. You're going to get the copy of these slides afterwards, but there is a list. It did get shut down, unfortunately, this website, so it's slightly outdated. There's some interesting backstory if you want to read as to why it got shut down. I find that kind of fascinating, but it is a pretty good list of different potential predatory publishers. So I often start there if I'm worried about it. It's a journal I haven't heard about before. And then the other thing is that often the ones that you get, and this is just a quick email that I'm showing you that I got, you get these emails once you start to publish, and they kind of say, please publish eminent author. And, you can highlight, like they typically are just over the top, right? And so that generally is my flag here. Somebody's saying, have a wonderful day. You're going to have a huge impact on your readers. Well, I wish, but that's definitely more of a predatory journal appearance. Okay, you heard last week or last month from Dr. Miner about Jane. And in case anybody wasn't here last month, I'll just briefly mention this. And so Jane is a website that is there where you can actually type in your keywords, you can type in your abstracts, you hit click, and it finds you some examples of journals that you might want to consider. So this is a great starting point overall if you just know your topic area of interest. And even if you've had an abstract, like you presented it in different forms, you pop that in here and you get some suggestions. Now, the other one that I want to bring to you is a different one that may not be as familiar, but it's called the Web of Science, and they have a master journal list. And so the cool thing about Web of Science is if you already have a manuscript, you can actually upload and it's been rejected. You upload your manuscript, you hit that match manuscript, and they spit out journals for you too. So I often use both as my resource, and I find cross-referencing between Jane and Web of Science is really helpful. Web of Science moves a little bit beyond some of our traditional biomedical journals too. So if you have something that might be interested in psychology, for example, or sometimes our work is behavioral health, maybe around, reproductive health and medicine, and might cross over into social sciences. Web of Science really does expand that lens, I think, a little bit more. Okay, the third way that I find journals is, and this is just a Google search I popped in this morning to make sure the strategy still works. And you just type in, something simple like journal publishing quality and safety in healthcare, and you're going to find compilations of lists that other people have done the work for you. So here I'm showing you two. There's one that's out there from University of Michigan on quality and safety. Yale has one right now. The nice thing is that they somebody else has done all the work for you, right? Looking if maybe if these are open access, if these are predatory, are they in PubMed or not? So I find these lists really helpful as well. I did want to mention this idea of an impact factor. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with that term. So sometimes you'll see that term, and what an impact factor is a calculation of how often in the past 2 years have articles from that journal been cited. So in some circles, that an impact factor is considered kind of important, because if you're publishing in a more reputable journal, then your work is out there and you're more likely to get cited or noticed from that. So then you get these magic numbers, that are from the calculation. And typically, my advice is to try to go with things that have an impact factor at least 1 or higher. And you can use that really to get a sense of the ones obviously that are going to be in like the upper teens, or even like upper 7 and above, are going to be harder to publish in overall. So when we were talking about that idea of what is your threat, or what is your tolerance for rejection, then you can use the impact factor as a way to get a sense of that rejection rate. Okay, so that's sort of the big blends. Now we're going to narrow in. So now you've gotten a list of names of different journals, and how are you going to go about actually figuring out which are the best ones? So the first thing I suggest is, I always say pick 2 to 3 journals, right? Because the chances of getting accepted on the first try, it's not always going to happen. And if you've already done the thinking before you have any sort of like emotional investment in the fact that you got rejected, can be really helpful. So clear-headedly, you're like, oh, I'm going to shoot for this. Next, if that doesn't work out, I'm going to go here. And then lastly, I'm going to go for here. After that, you might need to get some help or get some suggestions. So you jump into your journal and you actually look at the aims and scope. And this gets back to the idea of who's the audience do you want to publish with. So here's from our Journal of American Board of Family Medicine. And you can see what they're looking for is new knowledge to contribute to the understanding and advancement of family medicine research and clinical practice, right? So if it's about research and clinical practice, if you're doing something that's not necessarily research and clinical practice, you may not want to choose this journal. For example, they don't necessarily call out teaching in their aims and scope. The other thing, I highlighted, they publish every other month. So if you're in a hurry to get your work out in print, that's the other kind of thing you're going to notice, right? It might take a while before you see that out there, actually. But they do give a sense, and this is a little bit old, but they show, what their online hit rate is and how many people look at this. So again, thinking about your audience. Okay, the next thing I do is I look at the features of within a particular journal. And what you'll notice is that there's so many different ways to publish, right? So you could do a brief report, and that one does have teaching points of clinical relevance. So that's like maybe you've noticed something and you think other people could learn from that, from what has happened to you clinically. There's things such as research letters, which are really brief, and just a couple hundred words, just a table, a few abstracts, but it's a fast way to get things out. And then there's what we might think of as like the bigger scholarly research articles, these original research, and you see what they talk about, right? Primary care research, health services, and clinical care, lots of other choices. And then also want to point out that another way just to get yourself in the habit of writing is to do these reflections. And almost all of our family medicine journals do offer this space for poetry, professional experiences, perspectives, just even thinking about that as a way to write. And that can be a lot of fun. I know I published about what it was like, early in my career to be pregnant and be a physician, right? So just taking your lived experience, turning into like telling the story is another opportunity just to get publications out there. Okay. Other things that you'll notice is length is really different. And the reason it's important to go into this before you start writing your article is that it's kind of painful to write 3,000 words and realize, oops, I only want 800, right? Like going back is, a little over is fine because, work with your co-authors or chop. But you can see in general that, every one does have it, and it varies quite a bit between 600 words up to 3,500 words in this journal. So it's important to know that before you start writing. So you've got your 3 journals, and I just did this with our major ones in family medicine, and there's more than this, but just 3 of the ones that are out there. And you can see that there's a lot of differences when you get into the author's instructions, right? So Journal American Board of Family Medicine doesn't have any limit on how many figures and tables you can include. So if you have a lot of data that you want to share, maybe that's a good choice. If you have, a little bit, if you have a really concise story, you might choose one differently based on that. The other thing is, looking at authorship limits, right? So sometimes like you might be in a part of a large team and maybe a lot of learners that you're having coming along and have helped out with the scholarship and you want to help them with authorship. Well, some journals do have limits and others don't. And then lastly, often journals will ask you to provide keywords so that your articles are searchable. And so often they'll tell you, you have to restrict yourselves or you have a sort of unlimited ways to be found. Okay, so this is where we get into the really practical tips. And I don't know that necessarily lots of people do this, but I found this really helpful. So after I've narrowed myself down to my journals, then I try to go in and see, have there been articles similar to the way that I've done my study published in the past few years? So here's a quick example, right? So way back, we did a survey, and it was a huge survey of 10,000 people. And I only wanted to publish, thinking about this, I needed to go to a place that was comfortable with secondary analysis of a survey. So, this was the article. So we went to the journal, and yep, there were 3 different articles that were there that did these large surveys, and sent them out by mail as well. So I felt pretty confident that at least as a method, that's not going to cause any problems. Okay, so that was a rapid fire look at scoping. And I know I spent some time on it, but it's sort of like quality improvement, right? Like the first step is sort of understand and know what's out there and think about the problem. And then you get into the implementation. And that's really important, I think, with journal writing as well. Okay, so how do you write? I personally find it a lot of fun to write in groups. Right now there's not too many folks who do first author just by themselves publications. It's nice to get lots of perspectives. But there can be some potential like pitfalls when you're working in groups, and having clear processes is really important. So the first thing I often talk about is it's really important to have authorship guidelines, and place, and who's going to be the first author, who's the senior author, and what's your order. And typically, the first author is the person who does most of the work, right? And they can sometimes do a little less of the work with a lot of mentorship. Like if you have a senior mentor, I often do this where I'm probably pretty substantially involved with a first-time author that I'm working with. And I might be doing a fair amount, but I'm comfortable being in that senior place. It's about teaching and working with them really closely. But the main thing is to make sure every time you have an outline, put it on top and have those authors out there so that there's no question as you go along. Otherwise, it can be a little bit painful if somebody was like, wait, I thought I was going to be before that at all, the first 3 or whatever. So I do suggest doing that. And really being clear about who's doing what section, who's going to review. So there's sort of particular steps, right? Looking at the literature, who's involved with the literature. Is everyone going to do it? Is just the first author going to do it and report on it? So taking the different tasks of writing a paper, and we'll get into those a little bit more, and making sure who's assigned to what. And then lastly, I know this is a little bit difficult, but there's a lot of tasks that are involved with writing a paper that really don't need any sort of scientific or content expertise. And that means like formatting it to get the right margins, listing your references, and hopefully using like one of the free online reference managers to do that, so it's not so painful. And even putting it in the online submission form, there's just a lot of detail on typing. So if you can find any resources to help you with that, I do suggest to the extent that you can, turfing that off to someone who can do that. Here at University of New Mexico, we have undergraduate students who hope to go to medical school someday, and we've kind of worked out with them like a little like research assistant position where this is one of their job duties, and it's been a really win-win because they get some exposure to cool articles and topics, and they enjoy that as well. And then, okay. So this is what I suggest then. So when you're got your team together, I really think it's important to have a kickoff meeting with everybody present in the room. And often, this is where you really nail down who's going to do what, who does the authorship. I like people to walk out feeling productive at the end of that meeting. So we often pick our title at that meeting. It just gives us like a project definition or a name, and everybody can be creative and think of that title together. It starts to establish that kind of group ethos. The other thing I like to do is really mock up blank tables. So, you've talked about which journal you're going to go, you maybe have 3 to 5. Table 1 is pretty standard, right? It's always, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but table 1's always kind of like who participated in the study. So just coming up even with an Excel, it's like table 1, I want to talk about this. Table 2, I think we should include the questions that were asked, and table 3 should be, and just getting that basic frame of it can be really helpful to do in a group meeting. Next is like during that meeting, setting up a timetable, trying to get yourself nailed down to some commitments around when you want to get the first draft done. And also coming up with group process. When you send a draft out, what's an acceptable turnaround time? If you can get the group to say, yep, within 2 weeks, we're going to do it, or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, that's so helpful, because often a lot of the time is wasted chasing your co-authors, and they're just busy. But if you've talked about it, you have it in writing, and then you can refer to it when you send the email as discussed, please get this back by 2 weeks, and you've gotten buy-in. Lastly, I'm going to briefly mention there's different methods that groups work together. Sometimes people like to do this like time blocking, where you can even just be, the way I do it with my teams is like we jump on screen together. We're all going to work in different parts, and we just, go on Zoom, we go off camera, and then we come in the beginning, we say hello, we come at the end, and we're like, this is what I got done. And we just block and set aside time together. That's a really kind of fun way to make you do it. And again, continues the group ethos. I do have some co-authors who just don't like that. They're like, just let me do my thing. I want to write at 2 in the morning. And of course, we're not going to do that. So then what we try to get to is some sort of commitment around, can we check on your progress? Can you set, it's creating that accountability, right? So is it okay if, maybe sometimes the senior author, I'll do that. I'll take that role as like, I'm the one that's sort of, shepherding everybody along, saying, oh, you said you were going to work on this. How's that going? So, taking that on to move this along. So I definitely encourage having a group nagger and sort of assigning that as part of who's going to be the one to nag people to get things done. Okay, so here's an example. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but we try to really put things clearly in emails, and so you get some examples from mine. But when I talk to my co-authors in writing, I generally say this was a revise and resubmit, right? They gave us a ton of revisions. And so I'm really clear about, here's what I want, I need you to give me your feedback and approval on this revised and submit by this date. And then I need a couple of people to help me out with this, and then I do need, as part of authorship, everyone has to read the final draft and say that they approve. So I insist on all co-authors like sending an email just saying, I looked this over, this looks great, I approve. So you've sort of met the criterion for authorship. And then, the rest of it is just process and planning of how we're going to work together. Okay, so with that, I'm going to jump into going through the different sections of writing a paper now, and these go more quickly because it's kind of a formula, as you'll see. So introduction. So each one of these sections, I'm going to go through what are the big questions that you're trying to answer in each section. And then we'll go through a structure, and then we'll go through some tips. So the big questions in an introduction is, why did you do it? Right? It's really basic, but typically an introduction will start out with like, this is a really important problem because, and then there's some sort of gap, that made you say, oh, it's really worthy to do a study or to write a paper about this. Then you describe in your introduction a little bit about what you did. And then lastly, you might think about who cares, right? So that's the formula I often use in these questions to answer in an introduction. So you start out, and I've seen this described, and this is definitely not my own, but a reverse funnel, right? So your paragraph one is always 3 to 4 sentences on the broad topic, I don't know, like quality improvement in primary care is really needed because blah, 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 right? Like, and this is all these people are paying attention to it. And, so really setting the context in your first paragraph. Then you kind of narrow in on your specific area and gap, right? So it might be this particular population, among clinics that serve this population, quality improvements even needed more because, right? And these people have done this, but we still don't know this sort of thing. So that's always like paragraph 2 typically. Then you get into what you did, right? In this study, we're going to do this and that. If some journals want hypotheses, some don't. So, that's where your scoping comes in. But sometimes they want a single sentence saying, we hypothesize that people who, I don't know, did this lifestyle nutrition thing were more likely to have better outcomes in their A1C. And then I always end with intended audience. This is my style, but I like to put that in there and make it match what the journal said their scope was of who their readership is. So just like a little tip of how to do it. So here's an example. Again, I'm sprinkled in with my papers. That's just to show how I use this. But, so we did a study, and here's the last little part, right? Like we wanted to find out about the highest impact and most cost-effective combination that you can use to scale up an intervention for engaging patients in primary care team-based quality improvement work. Then here's what we did. We talk about our lessons, and here's the audiences. This is going to be useful to those who are interested in patient involvement and system redesign, evaluating practice transformation. So, you just put who it would be relevant to at the end of that first introduction. Okay, so some tips. Really important to use literature in your introduction that is current. Sometimes as a reviewer, I find people citing things that are like from 2000, even like 2000 in the late 1999s, and there's been more work done since then. So it's okay to do that if it's a very foundational article, but in general, try to keep your references within, the past 5 to 8 years to indicate that your work is, still relevant. This second tip, make sure you have references from the journal that we talked to you're going to submit to. And that partially helps because the editors are going to try to find reviewers for your work. And their reviewer pool is often people who've published in that journal. So it helps in one way. Number one, if you're familiar with that work, you avoid getting a reviewer who's like, wait, you forgot to cite me, which does, I don't know if it's true, but I think there might be a little bias, right? If somebody thinks of themselves as in this field and you forget them, that's usually not a good thing. And then secondarily, it just also confirms that your work is relevant to the journal. And then lastly, of course, we talked about pay attention to reference limits. And you don't really, I think people really get stuck on how comprehensive and how long do you have to do the lit review for the introduction. It's more about knowing the most current things. If you can find a couple review articles in your introduction, something that really summarizes whatever you're talking about, that can be super helpful, and knowing the gap where your work fits in to address the gap. Okay, methods. So methods I often find as the easiest section to write with, and I often start with methods first, just because all you're describing is what did you do, right? And that it's probably the most formulaic of all the paper writing that you do. So often in methods, what you think about is, mostly if you needed IRB, you need to have a statement about that. Practically every journal wants that up front. What is your setting? So who did you study this with and where? How did you collect your data and how did you analyze your data? So kind of following that flow is a really easy way to write the methods section overall. And so as I talked about finding articles that used a similar method that you did in your journal, the cool thing about that is that can really serve as a template for you. So, there's often subheadings like setting, participants, right, that other people have used. If you can find those subheadings and structure your methods the same way, that really will help you. And it at least will give you ideas if you don't want to do it. That's not going to ever be plagiarism. That's just like using an organizational structure. So it could either give you ideas or you could, add it on, right? So examples for headings might be statistical analysis, participants, study analysis. Yeah. So, and then the last little tip is you want to include the same level of detail in your sample articles. So some journals really want you to explain your methods, like, oh, we did a Delphi study, and a Delphi study is this and this and this, and here's a citation. Other journals are really comfortable with you just saying, we did a Delphi study to interview experts in the field of this, and just put a citation number. So even those little tips based using your template articles as that can be really helpful. Okay, results. So big questions on results. Number one is always who is part of your study, right? And that's always traditionally table one. So the nice thing is table one is also a really easy thing to do, just even as you're going about like collecting your data, coming up with what that table is pretty straightforward. And then of course, the results is where you say, what were your findings? Now, the main thing you want to do is, so we talked about doing these tables and figures, and some people only when you review, like generally, or even read articles, people really get focused on tables and figures, right? Like if you're in a hurry and you want to know what this article is about, that's where people spend time. So I really encourage you to spend a lot of time thinking about what is your major story in this result section, and is there a table or a figure that shows that story very well for people who don't want to read the text. And the text is more about adding additional details to that table and figure. But I think having those images and those ideas of what goes in there. So for example, if you're doing a qualitative study, you might end up putting a lot of your quotations and that detail in the figures with your themes. And then you're just describing in the text, like, we did a focus group and we came up with 6 themes. Themes are displayed in table 2. At the high level, they included this, this, and this, right? And then, you move on. So really trying to be succinct with your text, but using the figures for the detail is really important. Okay, so some tips. Results are always written in past tense. So, because you did it, right? You gathered this data you did in the past. I always think about 2 stories. So most people get lost if you have more than 2 stories in an article. So overall, what did you find, right? And then maybe in some subgroup, or there was something really interesting that you find and you talk about that. You could, so it's okay to not include every single piece of data that you said about to study, right? Sometimes you collect too much data, and that's okay to do. Be careful to not include any interpretation. Like I have seen people, particularly in their early articles, go surprisingly, I don't know, drinking coffee did not have an effect, right? So you don't want to put those little things like in this results section. It's just, where you try to stay really factual about it. And then the last tip is don't forget, often people get really excited when they see something that's significant, important, and this is quantitative here, but make sure you include the negative significant results too, right? Otherwise you look like you're really cherry picking on your results. So you want to really present a full picture, but 2 stories. Okay, discussion. So the discussion has a lot of big questions, right? This is where you tie it all together and you're trying to give the so what. So what does your work really add? How does it challenge or support what's out there already? And if you found something that was surprising to you, this is where you talk about it, right? Why, what was that? Like, what would somebody reading your article be really surprised by? And how would you explain that? What does this actually matter, right? What are the implications? And it's always nice to be humble, right? Like, so you usually say, if other studies find this too, this could really mean this really big thing or important thing. And then lastly, what didn't you do? What are the questions that you still have to answer that you wish you would in the future? So those are just some big things to get you thinking about how to write a discussion section. This is the opposite of the pyramid that I showed you in the introduction. So again, it's a formula in a, so paragraph 1 is where you always summarize your results. So one paragraph to say, in this study, we, surveyed people with this issue and we found that, and then, this is one of your findings. Here's another finding that we had too, and then sometimes you end with like a teaser sentence, like our findings indicate significant implications for whatever, right? So that's like a little concise paragraph for that. Your second paragraph, you always compare to other studies. So you identified in your introduction some studies that that had been done already in this field. And this is where you bring it back in paragraph 2. So you're either supporting, similar to these people, we found the same thing, but we also found this additional thing. So it's usually good to not be a complete me too. You hope you're not, exactly like what's been out there before. So hopefully you say, we're like this, and then here's where we're filling an additional gap, or where we found something in addition that was surprising. Paragraph 3 is usually where you pick your coolest finding, I guess, is the way I think about it, and you describe why it was so great and why it's important. Then it's important to always have at least 2 to 3 limitations. Limitations are often things like, we didn't have a huge sample, or our results might be only applicable in these settings, but they need to be done in another setting to be more generalizable. Often on a revise and resubmit, your reviewers will point out your limitations pretty well. So a way to address those reviewer concerns is like, oh, I can't go back and redo my study, but I'm going to include the things that they're bringing up that they think we should have done as limitations. So sometimes I don't have like the most sketched out limitation section going into submitting an article for the first time, and then I let them help me also identify some more. And then the last paragraph is those conclusions, right? Where you sort of restate your major finding or your major story, and then its implications. Why does it matter? Okay, so some tips. So in general, it's important you can really save a lot of time by referring to the same literature you cited into the reduction. So sometimes I see newer authors trying to like go in and get really philosophical and deep and adding a bunch of extra ideas. That's actually kind of confusing. You can do that a little bit, but you can keep it really tight by keeping yourselves within the same studies in the introduction and the discussion. And then next is, don't put limitations, things that your study could have easily addressed, because that's like a fatal flaw. Actually, reviewers will see that and they're like, well, why don't you go back and go do, that secondary survey of those people if it's only 5 people, so really try to include things in your limitations that it looks like it would take a lot of resources or more money to address. Okay, lastly, the abstract. So I deliberately put the abstract last because sometimes people start with abstracts and then your paper shifts and you forget to go back and see if it matches. And I've seen that happen a lot, where people mention like findings in the abstract as a reviewer. I've seen this and I'm like, wait, that's not in the paper. So it probably was used from some kind of conference. And going back to Dr. Miner's thing about making things count multiple times, I mean, that's really good to have an abstract like that you might have presented in the past, but I think it's important that you redo the abstract and look at it at the end of writing your article. So here's the big questions. Why did you do this? What was your objective? How did you do it? What are the most important findings, and what did your study reveal, or what did you conclude? So even if you could say that out loud, right? Like, so I know sometimes I get frozen on a page. I don't know if you all use dictation in your clinical practices, but sometimes I just like dictate my abstract answering these questions and then fill in the details just to get my brain kind of thinking about things in a different way. Some tips for abstracts: avoid mentioning anything that's not in the manuscript text. So I mentioned that already, but it happens so often. It's really surprising. Try to avoid jargon and abbreviations that won't be familiar. So a quick story about that. So you all know that by now that I do a lot of patient engagement and primary care quality improvement. So my co-authors and I got so tired of writing that entire statement out, patient engagement. So we decided to start using PEPQI as an abbreviation. Well, that like bombed completely. People are like, what the heck is this PEPQI thing that you're doing? And, I think it just got mad. Like we definitely had a reviewer just like flaming us over like using a non-standard abbreviation. So, QI for quality improvement. Yep, that's out there. But if you can avoid as much as possible abbreviations, I know that saves words in your abstract, but I think it does kind of like bother people. And I've had multiple experiences with that. Okay, so lastly, we're going to move into, I know this is a lot of content, so thanks for hanging in there, but lastly, we're going to move into some tips on finalizing your submission. So you've done all that hard work, you've got this ready, and then now what? I'm going to just give a quick thank you. This is all learned from one of my early mentors, Dr. Maureen Smith, who really helped me organize. So I just wanted to mention her. Okay, so back to the team, right? First, make sure your co-authors know that they're going to be getting a draft and review so that they know it's coming, especially if you have a hard deadline coming up. So revise and resubmit. So if you get to that point where you get your article back and they want some revisions, they're usually going to give you a deadline, right? Like we need to get this back within 6 weeks or 2 months. And so, I like to give my co-authors a heads up right away so they can start blocking time on their calendars because we're all really busy to look at this work. It's really important, again, I can't say this more enough, but each co-author does have to review those articles as part of being an author. That's just like a right of authorship in the international standards for that. So they do have to sign off, that they've read it. So next thing is, this is just good practice, but if a co-author gives you a suggestion or revision and you decide not to include it, make sure that you have time for a conversation with them about it. That's the best way that I've seen people sort of get burned out where they don't feel like incorporated or heard. So, so just to give a tangible example, we're writing a paper. I'm part of a team that I'm mentoring and writing a paper about Indigenous medical school curriculum right now. And, one co-author got very interested in the difference between colonialism and coloniality. And I know that may sound a little minor, but they're actually really strong definitions with it. So the entire paper was originally our manuscript was talking about colonialism, and this co-author felt very strongly we needed to shift to the word coloniality. So we had to make space and time for that discussion. For that. So that's just, an example. So people have these ideas and it could feel maybe just a word change or something, but you want to have that space to talk about it. I like to always inform authors of the different steps because, people put this on their CV and they like to know that things are submitted. So that's just another good practice. I think it's important to let your co-authors know if you've been accepted or rejected. They're also tracking things as well and remind them. So hopefully you have a concrete plan. This is where sometimes I fall down, but if you've gotten rejected, having, oh yeah, we were just going to go ahead and resubmit. Here's our next journal. And my typical advice, sometimes people can really get stuck on reading what all the critiques are, but often when you get rejected, it's more about not having the right fit. So sometimes what I do is just reformat, don't change a whole bunch, like maybe just spend a day looking at it, making some minor tweaks if there was like an aha in those reviewers. I have had that experience, and I've heard this from others, that if you spend too much time changing it for your original review where you're rejected, you send it out for review again, those reviewers tell you to go back and change what you did already because they just have a new take on it. So this is like the number one place people get stuck. Just turn it around as fast as you can if you've been rejected. The last two things are pretty obvious. There's often forms for co-authors to fill out. It includes the journal title. It includes, some details. If you can just fill that out for them, make it really easy for your co-authors. It's nice. And then I like to do this practice of just sending the citations in a format they can just cut and paste into their CV. Just make it really easy for everybody. So I just gave an example, right? So just simple email, and then they just cut and paste it. They've got it ready for them, and they're Yeah, you just take one little thing off their plate. Okay, this is the last thing. I'm just going to mention some resources and we will send these out afterwards. But I do love this particular article by Dr. Carrie-Ann Rocamore, who talks about dealing with the curse of the blank page and how to get past writer's block. Because I think for a lot of us, just getting started is scary. The cool thing she does is, she does the same thing, find the template. So she's also a fan of finding an article you're going to model off of. She does this very instrumental, calculate the word count ratio. So you're like, oh, it's only 500 words that I need to write an introduction. Oh, it's only 300. So she actually has you assign how many words each section is going to be, make a plan and SMART goals, and then, just let it get it out there and celebrate. So this is a really highly effective thing. If you actually just sit there and like, oh my goodness, this is not very many words, especially 2,000 words, pretty standard, and you break it up, it can feel much more doable. Lastly, this is another article from Annals of Family Medicine I'll send out, which talks about why shorter is better. And they really make a really good case of how to make your article more readable. So you can read these tips here. And the ways that things are readable is really keeping your words familiar. I think some people sit down and to write and they feel like they have to sound fancy and professorial. And so I say this all the time, instead of saying elucidate, just say explain, right? Instead of utilize, use. I mean, try to keep, the jargon down and just really simple, like talk how you would speak, write how you would speak, and that's very effective. Lastly, sentence length and structure really matters. Scientific writing is often very short, so you will not see a ton of clauses or commas. It's so different, from thinking back to when we used to write English papers for school. The simpler you can keep your sentences and, is better in terms of helping getting good reviews and just your readership again.